Thanks for attending. This is a talk about corporations hybrid, a case study on innovation in business law pedagogy. And really, this is a paper about an experience that I had with my student and teaching assistant and friend, David Tomasi. And together, he took my course in corporations, and then we had an experience working together to recreate that as a hybrid experience, which we'll discuss, and moving into online education. With that, let's get started. Ourselves briefly. I'm Seth Ornberg on the left here, and I teach at Duquesne University School of Law, and I teach contracts, and this will mainly be about corporations, but I'll introduce some of the business stuff I've done in contracts, doctrinal teaching, and venture capital law.
Yeah, and I'm David Tomasi. I'm a third year law student at Duquesne, and I'm a research assistant for Professor Ornberg.
We actually collaborated on this project, and so it's been really exciting to work with a student who actually took my class and then gave me honest feedback and helped me to build something better. So maybe just to start with the motivation, we wanted to do something new here, and the question is sort of why reinvent the wheel? Why try to introduce some new aspects to business pedagogy? And necessity is the mother of invention. And we had a situation where I teach in the evening division to students that are working 40 or 50 hours a week, taking a course 4 days a week for 3 hours a night, often managing a family. And it was just hard to get them to engage. It was hard to get them to engage with lecture format, that's just a passive learning style. And it was, well, for reasons that you'll see, a little difficult with Socratic as well. So we were looking for something else. And we were also looking because students were reporting, and we're hearing this more and more. David can share the students' perspective. A lot of anxiety around the high stakes of a final, and a lot of focus on how do I get the grade. Whereas I really wanted, I think Deborah touched on this. I really wanted the students to be thinking critically about corporations and society, and not just worried about how do I score the points in the exam, but really to take away something meaningful. And last but not least, the school has this huge initiative at Duquesne to go into hybrid and online learning. So there were incentives, grants that allowed me to hire David to develop something. And so we also had that impetus to try. So we first looked at what are our pedagogical options, and we have our classic Socratic and flipped options. So the paper talks about this a little bit. And what's I think really helpful about the paper is that David shares the student's perspective, which you don't hear enough about, I think, in terms of how this works for the new generation, not just millennials, but we're talking about Generation Z. So on the left, you see an image that really reflects the Socratic method. There's a few individuals gathered around the learned, bearded man who is, going to engage in a seeking of truth through a series of questions, turning the hypothetical. We're all familiar with that. Newer is the pedagogical flipped classroom method, which involves the information being presented outside of class. And then the students, at least theoretically, come to class with some basic understanding so they can apply what they learned. Um, in developing this, as you'll see, we'll talk about the pros and cons of both these methods, so you have some things to think about in terms of what you might implement and how you might adopt this. But we found that we could actually borrow from some of the strengths and weaknesses to create a hybrid approach, which we'll come to. But let's start with the student's perspective. I'll let David share this one. I picked this image for his expression. What was your experience as a student in a Socratic classroom?
Sure, and there's certainly quite a few strengths with the Socratic method. One is the ability to motivate students to prepare for class. I heard a professor talking about fear being a motivation, um, and whether that can be effective or not. And it certainly can be. The question becomes, though, what type of classroom environment are you trying to create? Uh, do you want an environment where students, want to come to class fearful, or do you want an environment where students feel comfortable and want to engage in class discussion? Uh, Another great advantage of the Socratic method is its use of those ready-made materials for professors to teach large volumes of classes in a short period of time. And most of those course materials are already in law school books, and law school books are already geared towards the Socratic method. And that, generally professors are simply more keen to the method and more familiar with the method. And this method has helped to produce many distinguished lawyers for the past century. but there's many weaknesses too. One significant criticism, at least among students, is the fear that the Socratic method imposes on students entering law school. And this fear can be a bit of a mind killer because most students don't have the ability to focus on this dense and time consuming material without being actively engaged with the materials, especially my generation, which is so technologically in tune. And so the professor might have already lost the attention of the majority of the students without even knowing it. Um, Additionally, the Socratic method may have a negative impact on group learning as well. And as I entered law school, the focus of the administration and on career services was always a focus on collaborative learning and group learning, but the Socratic method doesn't seem to aid in that process at all.
Yeah, that last point, as I kind of turn to the kind of professor's perspective, is a real problem. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis from the ABA, and I think it's good emphasis to have learning outcomes mapped and to also have those outcomes assessed. In other words, just think more critically about teaching what you test and testing what you teach. And so one big disadvantage of the Socratic method is it doesn't really reflect what's on the exam. And it doesn't really prepare students for that. It does prepare students for Supreme Court oral argument, but at least, from our perspective, that's not where our students are going. So it doesn't prepare them necessarily for practice in a direct way either. So my experience is that I have the fortune of having large and small classes. I get to teach a 12-person seminar in my specialty area of venture finance, and I teach 75-person classrooms in contracts. My experience is that I'm very effective in Socratic dialogue in small groups, and I become less effective as the class size gets larger. This is in part due to the nature of the classroom. The classroom I teach in is literally U-shaped, so I can't both engage one student on one side and without losing the other. My back is literally to them in a large classroom. It's just different than when I'm working with students in a smaller setting. And the other aspect to this is that students, I find, are less and less comfortable with this method of questioning. They're less and less used to speaking. They're more used to communication via text as opposed to voice. They're not fundamentally comfortable with this method. And as a Contracts 1L teacher, I've learned that students need to learn what the Socratic method is before they can even learn from it. So using this method in first year, particularly, I think slows the learning curve. And sometimes students, if they're having trouble learning, they'll tune out pretty quickly. And if you've lost them after a couple weeks, you may not get them back. And one way you can lose them is they can get entranced by their technology. I found that trying to employ the Socratic method in my classrooms heavily, students in large classrooms, they have Amazon, and if they're not following the Socratic dialogue, they'll go shopping. David's nodding over here.
Yeah,
right?
and I think there's also a point about to go to the point of tuning out. Even if you try to cut the technology completely, students are always going to find a way to tune out or undistract themselves or distract themselves. So if you say no books and just a pencil only in the case book, students are going to be putting in a cell phone in their book and texting or something like that. So it's always good to try to blend the technology as well as the classroom into the classroom experience.
So the flipped classroom method appealed to me because I felt that I would stop fighting with technology and use it more, embrace it more. And I'm a technophile. I used to work in a tech law firm and help start tech companies. So I wanted to employ this, and David and I got jazzed about what we learned in some of the latest pedagogy on this. So the flip method, briefly, is basically the use of instructional videos outside the classroom so that students come to class prepared to engage in higher order thinking. But fundamentally, what I learned from doing this in contracts classes, this is making a bold assumption that students are effectively completing the first stages of learning, meaning recall of the issues and the facts and understanding of the law outside of the classroom through these either readings or videos. And I actually found that that wasn't always, in fact, was frequently not the case, especially for some of our struggling students. And once again, if they're on their own, they have to be motivated, self-directed learners. The issue with both the Socratic method and the flip method, therefore, is that the work that the students do to get ready for class is very passive. And watching a video is passive in a way that is potentially more passive than reading a case, and for that matter, briefing a case. But I found more and more, we could provide the students with lots of tools, and they were actually feeling like they were watching them. They were actually had the videos running, but they'd be folding laundry or, cooking dinner or driving and listening to these things passively or reading these things passively. So when they got to class, they hadn't actually completed the first steps on that hierarchy of learning, and they weren't prepared for the application. At least the low perform, the bottom quartile, the bottom third. And so if I tried to flip the classroom and have an engaged experience, they weren't prepared to do that, and so I had to kind of be remedial in class. So given these experiences, we kind of put our heads together and we developed what we call the hybrid method. The hybrid method is a term we employed because we were really trying to blend the best benefits of the Socratic method and the flip method, and also the best benefits of in-class learning and synchronous learning with asynchronous learning. And so by putting these things together, we hope to have really the best of all possible worlds. And there are three things that distinguish the hybrid method from the flipped method and Socratic method, respectively. The first is that we focus on active learning experiences. So just like the flipped classroom, we have students watch videos before class. And just like the Socratic method, we have students read cases before class. But in addition, all of these exercises are paired with online activities that force them to actively engage with their learning. And this begins that process of cataloging their knowledge and connecting multiple concepts. That makes them also more prepared for class. So the class experience, we know that the students are coming in with a baseline of knowledge because we can actually see what they know from reading their posts online and seeing that they completed the assignments. So we can actually now more safely assume that they have a certain base of knowledge, so we can start the class at a higher level and get more quickly into discussion and analysis and group work. But also, this was a big payoff I wasn't expecting. I was able to identify students that had particular interests in subject areas or did research on particular topics, and I could engage those specific students in the Socratic dialogue. And I knew these students would be comfortable talking about those things because they had written about them. And because they had a certain amount of expertise on the topic, they actually were very effective in the Socratic dialogue, which was very helpful to the rest of the class. They felt good. It was good for their ego to show off their expertise in front of their classmates, so they were happy. They weren't afraid to be called on. A lot more volunteering. And this I'm referring to as targeted Socratic because I targeted or identified the student based on how they performed on the activities. And again, this is distinguishable from the general Socratic method where you walk into a room of 75 students and you pick one at random to call upon. But all this is more work, right, David?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and the students felt that they were doing a lot of work outside the classroom, so I needed to give them something back. And this was a more efficient way of learning, so I was able to leverage the recent ABA permission to have shorter class periods if you have substantial online activity. And you can cut up to one third of your class time provided that you make up for it with online learning. And I can say that the students really appreciated this, both in terms of students that wanted to get home earlier. These are students that sometimes work from they have raising families, so they're up all night with the kids. Then they are working 9 to 5 at a downtown office, and then class from 6 to 9, 4 or 5 days a week, plus other commitments. So getting home an hour early made a difference to them. Got home in time to put the kids to bed, or being able to cut a couple class sessions will really be appreciated by commuter students. And this is permissible and in fact really is I think required because David, you got the impression the students were doing more work, right?
Yes, absolutely. Especially in the beginning, it felt like I think there was that fear of the unknown and not understanding how much work was going to be involved in this. But I think as the class started going, they quickly learned what would be expected of them.
Right. But these activities, you can't fake it.
Right.
You can't just mail it in. You actually have to do them. And the discussion boards in particular, we got feedback from students that they felt there was some peer pressure to do a good job
Right.
because it was very visible and it was just out there. You either did the work or you didn't. As a result, the students did the work. but they're not always used to doing the work. So
Hmm.
we had to give them something back to make this have the payoff. But I think it really worked out well.
I do. I
And
do too.
so let's talk about how to actually put it into practice. So David and I worked together to try to build this uh, experience. David, you want to talk a little bit about what were our objectives and how we actually did this? Maybe at this point, by the way, our audience members might think, "Oh, this might be a good idea." So here's how we did it.
Right, exactly, and so we touch about we talk on these objectives in the next couple of slides. I'll just talk about them briefly. So there's three key objectives that you want to focus your attention on when flipping a classroom. The first is to craft these short and crisp videos which address each of the topics that you want to present to your students. And that really sounds easier said than done, especially given the complexity of the topics, and the length of a particular case that you wish to talk about in a video. It certainly takes some time, and you might. And one thing I want to talk about, we discussed a little bit in the video, or in the slide next, is that you may already have a baseline for your videos. And what I mean is, you might already have many of your classes recorded, to comply with Americans with Disabilities Act for your, for disabled students to go back and watch recordings of your videos. So you might already have many of your videos recorded for your semester throughout the years. So that's certainly a thing to consider, especially on crafting these videos, and so you won't have to reinvent the wheel. Second objective is, once you create these crisp and clear videos, you want to craft activities that are going to focus on assessing students' knowledge of these videos. And this can be measured through quizzes or essays, journal entries, discussion board posts, and we include them all in our flipped classroom experience. And the third objective is, once you create all of this, you have to create an online classroom or an online portal or an online platform for students to access the material. We use at Duquesne a system called Blackboard. Other universities use a system of Desire to Learn. You could also create your own website and use that as a platform for your videos and assessments.
So to drill a little deeper into the videos, so yes, particularly with business pedagogy, the videos are really important because students will come into it from different aptitudes, and especially in the night section, but also true in the day section. You have some non-traditional students there too. You'll have students that went straight through from undergrad. They're 22 years old. They have a degree in sociology or English, and have no experience working for a business, and they don't really know what interest rates really mean. And you have other students that are writing loan officers at PNC Bank. So I found one thing the videos could do is level set. And I could offer a variety of videos on a variety of topics, and students could watch additional videos if they needed supplemental information. But in order for this to function properly, you have to have the videos chunked up and parsed out. Most pedagogy will recommend 4 to 8 minute videos. That is incredibly short if you really try to do it. In fact, if you've ever heard a law professor talk, you'll know that we tend to go on a little bit. So how do you accomplish that? Well, it was harder than you might think. I had designed the course originally in a modular format, and I taught 3 to 5 modules a year, a semester rather, based on credit allotments and other things. Now I was thinking about it in terms of having 45 to 50 lessons, really getting down to a granular level. Now, this was a really productive exercise for me to think through exactly what I'm teaching, and I wrote out 3 to 5 learning objectives for every single lesson. So I ended up compiling 150 learning objectives that could be accomplished in corporations, and again, at a very granular level. Maybe you'd call them performance criteria, but very, very granular objectives. And then the videos would really try to accomplish no more than 3 of these very granular objectives. We created some rubric around that. So if, for example, if we were doing scripting, we would make sure the script was no more than 1,000 words. We would have a heading every 100 to 200 words, and that's how we formed our slides. So the slides were kept to 10 slides maximum for a presentation. So we had all these restrictions we put upon ourselves to try to keep the videos short, and that required a lot of time. We also did some scripting. As David mentioned, I've been recording my classes and making them available for a long time. I all have a YouTube channel, and so you can access many of these videos and see for yourself. I'm sure the quality varies, but I've tried to make everything that's worth, I think, watching available for the public just to increase knowledge. And as a result, I had access to a lot of prior content, and I could download the scripts from there and start with that and have that as a starting or a foundational point for writing these videos. That made things a bit easier. David also did a lot of work with cutting some of my previous videos into much shorter segments. Quite frankly, that was less effective than starting from scratch, but it was also a heck of a lot easier. And we put hundreds of hours into this. There was some amount of technical proficiency required. So before you embark on this journey, you really want to think about your school's aptitude for this as well as your own. I had some background or experience using iMovie, and I was comfortable using Final Cut Pro, so I was able to do some post production. I trained David to do it as well. But at FSU, when I was a visiting assistant professor there, they had an AV team that could do this work. At Duquesne, we don't. So whether or not you're able to engage in this might depend on that capacity, because students are used to high quality video content on YouTube, and you have to kind of get there. Anything else on that, David?
No, I think it makes a once your videos are complete, you have this workable product that you can use year after year. Generally, the law doesn't change too much, from year to year, as long as your casebook might, the same
Yeah.
cases are.
Or at least most of the chunks don't
Yeah.
change. If the chunks are small enough,
Yeah.
if Citizens United gets overruled,
Yeah,
we'll,
right.
we'll sub that one out.
Right.
But some of the basic concepts about social responsibility are still, relevant. So again, we tied this to activities, and there are a lot of different ways to engage your students, including having them write journal reflection entries, which are private to them, essays, which would be evaluated. And quite frankly, I tried to do this in my classes, but it was hard to keep up with grading them weekly. It was huge time consumption. I actually had a teaching assistant for my contracts class. She was only allotted 5 hours a week by the school. She could not grade 70, even short answers, given 5 hours a week. So the resources required, again, are pretty high to do this. I think a lot of people underestimate how resource intensive some of this stuff is. Quizzes are better because they're multiple choice and you can assess things that way. But I want to focus on discussion boards because those are tricky and sometimes really loathed by students. Plus, once I show you this, I get to be put on Deborah's list. So take a look at my discussion board question. I'll give you just a second to review it, then I'll talk about it. So this is an example of a discussion board exercise that I found to be highly effective and allowed me to really apply the hybrid method effectively. So the topic is corporate social responsibility, and this is a good topic for a discussion board. Policy topics are good topics for discussion boards because they give students a chance to express themselves and dig deeply into material. And so this was a good choice for that. There are some things that are a little bit more doctrinaire, and those may not lend themselves as well. So be selective about the content first and foremost. The next thing is I really made sure that this was in a small group. So I divided my 50 students up into 5 10-person groups. My first discussion board had everyone in it, and quite frankly, it is tedious to the point of tearing your hair out to try to read 50 discussion board posts, which all have some basic prompt and say something novel or new. Students find that very frustrating. However, in this particular instance, there was only 10 students in the group, and I gave them each a specific prompt. They each had a little research project. So they all went out and did their own YouTube research on a greenwashing or CSR comparison case. This meant they had to understand the CSR concepts, and then they did a little independent work. And moreover, they became mini subject matter experts. They had now something to contribute. So I reviewed all these comments, and of the ones that I found to be the most insightful, I noted those students. I sometimes told them that over email in advance, asked their permission to call on them in class if I knew they were a more skittish type student. And this gave the students lots of notice about what they'd be asked about. And so when I engaged them in a Socratic dialogue about For example, Lego's initiative to have their blocks made out of biodegradable plant-based plastics or what have you, they were really prepared to discuss on a deep level about that. And so the Socratic dialogue was much more interesting for the rest of the class. The class even got involved in asking those students questions because they recognized them as having some expertise. And I didn't get any of the nervousness that you usually get when you're just randomly cold calling. So it actually was really neat to see how the flipped approach lends itself to an improvement in Socratic dialogue. And these are not, it's not flipped versus Socratic. There are ways that you can flip to actually improve your Socratic experience. And discussion boards help me do that in this instance. So before we conclude, I just want to say a few brief comments about the online learning environment I was required to use. I'm not a fan of Blackboard. I'll just be clear about why. It has the advantage of being familiar, and many of you have used it, but it quite frankly has an outdated look and feel, and most students today expect a more modern interface. So I want to just sort of a general recommendation if you're involved in any type of policy level decisions at your institution, consider Canvas and Blackboard Ultra. They are more expensive solutions, but if your school really wants to make a commitment to online learning, you'll have to invest hundreds and hundreds of hours of faculty time into building these environments, and they don't translate from Blackboard to Canvas easily at all. Blackboard has the advantage of being secure, and it usually ties in with institutional systems like we have Banner and other ways of tracking students. But it's very clunky. It takes like 7 steps to do things that should be drag and drop with a modern interface. So it was much more time consuming. I actually took an intensive 8-week course on how to design a class in Blackboard, which combined pedagogy with the technical aspects. And despite having, it was basically the equivalent of a 2-credit class in terms of workload. I came away from that still, struggling with some of the tools and constantly, trying to, especially if I was really trying to push the envelope. It just is not an advanced platform in my opinion. What was and the last but not least is that it's hard to migrate things around. So one of the big problems with getting involved in this approach is that you'll have to create a lot of materials from scratch, in part because there aren't bodies of materials out there. There's not a library of videos you can easily purchase for your students or access. And it's hard to share these Blackboard environments, even if I'd like to. I have a good colleague. He needed to attend a conference, and getting my module from my site to his site took 3 days, and the Blackboard support team took them 3 days to process that. So I think that this will become more of a possibility as we evolve the systems. Any thoughts from a student's perspective on the system?
Yeah, I agree in its clunkiness, and sometimes professors will forget to flip the visible, the invisible to visible, and students might not even be able to see the assignment, and sometimes the whole thing can go down just on
Yeah, or
a
if you don't check just the right box, the feedback doesn't appear, or
Yeah.
the students have trouble going back and redoing the exam. You have to program it just right. It's error prone. But it's what we have, and we were able to make it work. But if you are in a policy position at your school, I'd suggest that you look at other newer products. So in conclusion, before we stop for questions, I just think we were really happy with this exploration. It was a pilot project to try to hybridize the corporations class. It was extremely time intensive, and I look forward to teaching this course again and to perfecting what we have, because it will be less of a time investment, and so I can invest more of that time in reading the discussion boards instead of creating them. But it really paid off for the students, and I had the best discussions I've ever had about corporate social responsibility and Citizens United and those big meaty policy topics. The students that normally don't participate, and I got emails from students that said, "You changed my entire perspective around corporations and society, and you made me do the work," which is a double-edged sword. This is a system that demands students work hard. It's very visible if they work hard or not. In fact, one of the negative feedbacks about discussion boards is students were anxious that their peers would judge them based on the quality. So there was a little bit of fear there too. I'm not sure it was a terrible thing because it did motivate hard work.
That's true.
But it was a lot of work, and so you have to give the students something back. We gave them a little bit of time back in their lives, which is something our night students really value. I think it was overall a successful project. We learned a lot. Hopefully, by writing it up and sharing with you, you can learn from our both what we did right and what we did wrong. So, any closing
No, I
thoughts?
agree. I think it turned out to be an excellent product, and again, I think we Professor Ornberg will be able to use this, you know, come years after year after year now that we've developed it. So I found it to be a good success. From what I've heard from students, they have initially, of course, they were fearing the unknown at first, but they certainly enjoy it. They enjoy the group discussions. They enjoy coming to class now and having positive group discussions.
Yeah. So with that, I'll end the share.